For 35 years, I lived in a rental house and paid rent every month. But when the landlady died, the notary called me and said, "She left you this house. Now it's yours." I couldn't believe my eyes until... Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. For 35 years, I had lived in the same rented house on Maple Street. 35 years of paying rent every single month, never missing a payment, never asking for favors. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, my landlady, had become more than just someone I paid rent to. She was my friend, my confidant, the grandmother figure I never had. We shared tea on Sunday afternoons. I helped her with groceries when her arthritis got bad, and she always remembered my birthday with a homemade apple pie. Life was simple, predictable, comfortable. I had my routine, my little garden in the backyard that Eleanor let me tend, my spot on the porch where I watched the neighborhood children play. At 72 years old, I wasn't looking for adventure or change. I had buried my husband 10 years prior. My children lived across the country with their own families. And this house, this borrowed space, had become my entire world. Then everything changed on a cold Tuesday morning in March. I was watering my geraniums when I saw the ambulance pull up to Eleanor's main house next door. My heart dropped into my stomach. I rushed over, my arthritis screaming in protest, just in time to see them wheeling her out on a stretcher. She looked so small, so fragile under that white sheet. Our eyes met for just a moment, and she gave me the faintest smile before they closed the ambulance doors. She died 3 days later. Peacefully, they said, in her sleep at the hospital. She was 91 years old. The funeral was small, quiet. I sat in the back pew of the church, crying silently into my handkerchief. That's when I first saw them, Eleanor's family. Her nephew Richard and his wife Patricia, swooping in from Boston where they'd lived for the past 20 years. They hadn't visited Eleanor once in all the time I'd known her, not once. She used to mention them sometimes, the sadness creeping into her voice when she talked about how busy they were, how they never called. But now, here they were, dressed in expensive black clothes, dabbing at dry eyes with silk handkerchiefs, playing the part of grieving relatives. After the service, Richard approached me. He was a tall man with cold gray eyes and a smile that didn't reach them. "You must be the tenant," he said, not bothering with pleasantries or condolences. "We'll need to discuss the property situation soon. I'm sure you understand." The property situation? I stood there, numb, barely able to process his words through my grief. Eleanor had been gone for less than a week, and he was already talking about business? I've been paying rent for 35 years, I managed to say. "I have a lease agreement." "Month to month, I'm sure," Patricia chimed in, her voice syrupy sweet, but her eyes sharp as knives. "Those arrangements can be adjusted. We'll be in touch." They walked away, leaving me standing there with a growing pit of dread in my stomach. What did they mean, adjusted? 2 weeks later, I received a letter. Not from Richard and Patricia, but from a lawyer's office downtown. My hands shook as I opened it, and I had to read it 3 times before the words sank in. I was being summoned to the office of Attorney James Morrison regarding the estate of Eleanor Marie Whitmore. Why would Eleanor's lawyer want to see me? I was just a tenant, just a renter who'd been lucky enough to know a kind woman for 3 decades. I barely slept that night, my mind racing through possibilities. Were they evicting me? Had I done something wrong? Had Eleanor left debts that somehow involved me? The morning of the appointment, I put on my best dress, the navy blue one I'd worn to my own husband's funeral, and took the bus downtown. My hands wouldn't stop trembling. The law office was in one of those old brick buildings with creaky wooden floors and frosted glass doors. Very formal, very intimidating. The receptionist led me to Mr. Morrison's office. He was a kind-looking man in his 60s, with wire-rimmed glasses and gentle eyes. But it was the other person in the room who made my blood run cold. Richard Whitmore sat in the corner, his arms crossed, his face twisted in barely concealed anger. What was he doing here? Mr. Morrison gestured for me to sit down, and then he opened a folder on his desk. "Mrs. Harrison," he began, "I've asked you here today regarding Mrs. Whitmore's last will and testament." My heart hammered so hard, I thought everyone in the room could hear it. Richard shifted in his chair, the leather creaking under him. The sound felt ominous, threatening. Mr. Morrison continued, his voice steady and professional. Mrs. Whitmore made several revisions to her will over the years. The final version, signed and witnessed 6 months before her passing, contains a provision that directly concerns you. 6 months ago? Eleanor had never mentioned anything to me. We'd had tea that very week, talked about planting roses in the spring, discussed whether to get a new bird bath for the garden. Not a word about lawyers or wills. "This is ridiculous," Richard interrupted, his voice sharp. "My aunt was clearly not in her right mind those last few months. She was old, confused." "Mr. Whitmore," the lawyer's tone turned cold, "your aunt was examined by 2 independent physicians and found to be of completely sound mind when she made these changes. I have the documentation right here." Richard's jaw clenched, but he fell silent. Mr. Morrison turned back to me, and I saw something that might have been compassion in his eyes. "Mrs. Harrison, Eleanor Whitmore has left you the property you've been renting for the past 35 years. The house, the land it sits on, and all its contents. It's yours, free and clear." The room spun. I gripped the arms of my chair, certain I'd heard wrong. What?" "The house is yours," Mr. Morrison repeated gently. "She left a letter for you as well. Would you like to read it now or take it home?" I couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. 35 years of rent, every month, never missing a payment. And now? "This is theft!" Richard exploded from his chair. "She manipulated my aunt, 35 years of worming her way into an old woman's affections. And for what? To steal our family's property." "Our property?" The words cut through my shock like ice water. He'd never visited, never called, never cared about Eleanor when she was alive, and now he dared to claim ownership of her love, her choices, her home. "Mr. Whitmore, please sit down," Mr. Morrison said firmly. "Your aunt's will is legally binding. She left you and your wife a considerable sum of money and several pieces of valuable jewelry. You are not without inheritance." "I don't want jewelry," Richard spat. "That house has been in our family for 3 generations. It's worth $500,000. She had no right." "She had every right," the lawyer interrupted. "It was her property to dispose of as she wished." Richard turned to me, his eyes blazing with fury. "You won't get away with this. I'll contest the will. I'll prove you manipulated her, isolated her from her family." "I never isolated anyone," I found my voice, though it shook. "Where were you for 35 years? Where were you when she needed groceries? When she fell and hurt her hip? When she spent Christmas alone because her family couldn't be bothered to visit? How dare you?" "Gentlemen, Mrs. Harrison." Mr. Morrison stood up, clearly done with the confrontation. "Mrs. Harrison, I'll need you to sign some paperwork, and then the property will be transferred to your name. Mr. Whitmore, you're welcome to contest the will, but I should warn you, it's airtight." Mrs. Whitmore anticipated objections and took every legal precaution. I walked out of that office in a daze, clutching Eleanor's letter in my trembling hands. Richard and Patricia stood in the parking lot, their faces masks of rage. Patricia stepped forward, her sugary voice now pure venom. "This isn't over," she hissed. "That house should be ours. We're her blood family. You're nothing but a tenant who got lucky." They drove away, leaving me standing there alone. That night, sitting in my own living room, I finally opened Eleanor's letter. Her handwriting was shaky, but unmistakable. "My dearest friend, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. Don't cry for me. I've lived a long, full life. This house has been your home for 35 years. You've cared for it, loved it, made it beautiful. More importantly, you cared for me when my own family forgot I existed. You were the daughter I never had. This is not charity. This is gratitude and love and justice. The house is yours. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Be happy here. Live fully. That's all I ask. With all my love, Eleanor." Tears streamed down my face, but through them, something else emerged. Determination. Richard and Patricia wanted a fight? They thought they could bully me into giving up Eleanor's gift? They thought I was just a helpless old woman? They had no idea who they were dealing with. I had buried a husband, raised 3 children through poverty, survived cancer, and lived alone for a decade. I had been paying my own way, standing on my own feet, for longer than they'd been alive. I wasn't going anywhere. The next morning, I made my first call. To a real estate attorney who specialized in probate disputes. Margaret Chen came highly recommended. She was in her 40s, sharp as a tack, with a reputation for being absolutely ruthless in court. When I sat across from her in her downtown office, she listened to my entire story without interrupting, taking notes in a leather-bound notebook. "Do you have Eleanor's letter?" she asked when I finished. I pulled it from my purse, still in its envelope. I'd been carrying it everywhere, like a talisman. Margaret read it carefully, then looked up at me with a slight smile. "This is beautiful. It also establishes clear intent and sound mind. Combined with Mr. Morrison's testimony about the medical evaluations, you're in an excellent position." "But they're going to contest it," I said. "Richard told me as much." "Let them." Margaret leaned back in her chair. "Mrs. Harrison, I need you to understand something. In probate disputes, especially when family members contest a will, they usually try to prove either undue influence or lack of mental capacity. Given that Eleanor had medical evaluations confirming her competence, they'll likely go for undue influence." "What does that mean?" "They'll try to prove you manipulated her, that you isolated her from her family, controlled her decisions, maybe even that you were cruel to her, and she changed the will out of fear." The accusation hit me like a physical blow. "That's absurd! Eleanor was my friend. I believe you, but we need to prove it. Do you have any documentation of your relationship? Letters, cards, photographs?" I thought about the box in my closet. 35 years of birthday cards from Eleanor. Photographs of us at church picnics, gardening together, baking cookies at Christmas. Receipts from the groceries I'd bought for her. The medications I'd picked up from the pharmacy. "I have everything," I said. Over the next week, I gathered it all. Every scrap of paper, every photograph, every receipt. Margaret's assistant helped me organize it chronologically. The picture that emerged was undeniable. A deep, genuine friendship between 2 women who'd chosen to be family to each other. But I needed more than that. I needed to prove that Richard and Patricia had been absent, neglectful, that they had no moral right to question Eleanor's decision. That's when I remembered Eleanor's journals. She'd been a faithful diary keeper, writing in leather-bound journals every night before bed. I'd seen them on her nightstand countless times, After her death, when I'd helped sort through her personal effects in the main house before Richard and Patricia had shown up, I'd carefully packed them away. Now I retrieved them from the box in my garage where I'd stored Eleanor's most personal items, intending to eventually decide what to do with them. My hands shook as I opened the first one, dated from 15 years ago. It felt like a violation of privacy. But Eleanor had left me her house. Surely she wouldn't have done that if she didn't trust me with her truth. The entries were heartbreaking. Another Christmas alone. Richard sent a card. Generic, impersonal. Didn't even sign it himself, just the Whitmores in Patricia's handwriting. I called to thank them and got their answering machine. They never called back. My birthday today. I'm 76. Richard forgot. But dear Margaret next door, that was me. My first name is Margaret, though everyone calls me by my last name, Harrison. Brought me a homemade cake and we had tea on the porch. She remembered my favorite flavor, lemon with raspberry filling. She pays more attention to me than my own blood. I fell today in the garden, hurt my wrist badly. Margaret heard me cry out and came running. She drove me to the emergency room, stayed with me for 4 hours, brought me home and made me dinner. When I tried to call Richard to let him know I'd been hurt, Patricia answered and said they were too busy with a work function to talk. Too busy. Always too busy. Page after page, year after year. A chronicle of loneliness, of a family that had abandoned her, and of the quiet, steady presence of the tenant next door who had become her truest companion. I called Margaret Chen immediately. I found proof, I said. Eleanor's journals. 15 years of documentation showing that Richard and Patricia were completely absent from her life. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Can you bring them to my office tomorrow morning? Yes. Don't tell anyone you have these. Not yet. I understood. This was our ace in the hole. But someone must have seen me visiting Margaret's office repeatedly. Small towns talk, and lawyers' offices are watched. 3 days later, I received a visit I hadn't expected. Patricia showed up at my door, all smiles and sweet perfume, carrying a casserole dish. Margaret, she said, using my first name like we were old friends. May I come in? I think we got off on the wrong foot, and I'd like to make amends. Every instinct I had screamed danger, but I also wanted to know what she was up to. I stepped aside and let her in. She set the casserole on my kitchen counter and turned to me with what she probably thought was a sincere expression. I want to apologize for Richard's behavior at the lawyer's office. He was grieving, and he spoke out of turn. Grieving? The man who hadn't seen his aunt in 20 years? We've been thinking, Patricia continued, sitting down at my kitchen table without being invited, and we realized that Aunt Eleanor clearly cared about you very much. We respect that. I said nothing, waiting. But you have to understand our position. That house has been in the Whitmore family for generations. It has sentimental value beyond money. She paused, letting that sink in. So, we'd like to make you an offer. Here it was, the real reason for her visit. We'll pay you $200,000, cash, for the house. That's well below market value, yes. But think about it. You'd have financial security for the rest of your life. You could move somewhere easier to maintain, closer to your children, perhaps. No more worrying about property taxes or repairs. $200,000. It was more money than I'd ever had in my life. It was also less than half what the house was worth. And if I say no? I asked quietly. Patricia's smile thinned. Then we'll be forced to contest the will. It will be long, expensive, and painful for everyone involved. These things can drag on for years. The legal fees alone. She shook her head sadly. At your age, do you really want to spend your final years fighting in court? There it was. the threat wrapped in concern. I looked Patricia directly in the eyes. Eleanor wanted me to have this house. I'm not selling it. Her smile vanished instantly, replaced by cold fury. You're making a mistake. Perhaps. But it's my mistake to make. She stood up abruptly, grabbing her casserole dish. Apparently, I wouldn't even get to keep the food. You'll regret this. We'll prove you manipulated a vulnerable old woman. We'll drag your name through the mud. By the time we're done, everyone in this town will know what kind of person you really are. Get out of my house, I said quietly. Your house? She laughed bitterly. We'll see about that. The next day, Margaret Chen called me with news. They've officially filed to contest the will. It's happening. I expected as much. There's more. They've hired Preston and Associates. They're a large firm out of Boston. Very expensive, very aggressive. My stomach tightened. What does that mean for us? It means they're serious and they have deep pockets. But Margaret, we have something they don't. The truth. Eleanor's journals are gold. I've had my paralegal go through them. There are over 200 entries documenting their absence and your presence in Eleanor's life. I spent the next week preparing my deposition with Margaret. We went over every detail of my relationship with Eleanor, every moment, every interaction. It was exhausting, dredging up 35 years of memories, but it was also cathartic. I realized, perhaps for the first time, just how much Eleanor and I had meant to each other. Then came the ambush. I was in my garden, trimming the roses, when a black Mercedes pulled up to my curb. Richard got out, followed by 2 other people, a man in an expensive suit carrying a briefcase, and a woman with a camera. Margaret Harrison? The suited man called out. Yes? I'm Douglas Preston, representing Richard and Patricia Whitmore in the matter of the Eleanor Whitmore estate. This is a court-appointed investigator. We're here to inspect the property. You can't just... Actually, we can. The house is part of the disputed estate. We have a court order. He held up official-looking paperwork. My hands were shaking, but I managed to pull out my phone and call Margaret Chen. They're here, at my house. They say they have a court order to inspect. Don't let them in without me there. I'm 20 minutes away. Stall them. I put my phone away and turned to Douglas Preston. My attorney is on her way. You can wait. We don't need to wait, Richard said, stepping forward with a key in his hand. This was my aunt's house. I still have a key. This is my property now, I said firmly, positioning myself in front of the door. You're not coming in without my lawyer present. Richard's face turned red with rage. You think you can stop us? You're just a gold-digging tenant who... Mr. Whitmore, Douglas Preston interrupted, placing a hand on Richard's arm. Let's wait for her attorney. We don't want any complications. Those 20 minutes felt like hours. Richard paced on my lawn, glaring at me. The investigator took photographs of the exterior of the house. Patricia's car pulled up, and she got out looking triumphant, like they'd already won. When Margaret Chen arrived, she read the court order carefully. This is legitimate, she said quietly to me, but I'll be with you the entire time. They went through my house like locusts, opening drawers, photographing rooms, taking notes on everything. The investigator paid particular attention to anything that might have belonged to Eleanor originally: furniture, decorations, personal items. These candlesticks, the investigator said, pointing to a pair of silver candlesticks on my mantel. Were these Mrs. Whitmore's? She gave them to me, I said, for Christmas 8 years ago. Do you have proof of that? Did I have proof? A card, maybe? Somewhere in my boxes of memorabilia. But having to prove that every gift Eleanor had given me over 35 years was actually a gift and not stolen property, it felt violating, demeaning. Richard picked up a photograph from my bookshelf. It showed Eleanor and me in the garden, both of us laughing, covered in dirt from planting bulbs. "Quite the actress," he muttered, "getting her to trust you like this." "Put that down," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "That's my personal property." "For now," Patricia said from across the room, "everything in this house should have been ours." "That's enough," Margaret Chen stepped in. "You've done your inspection. Time to leave." Douglas Preston nodded. "We have what we need, for now." They filed out, leaving my house feeling violated, contaminated by their presence. I sank into my armchair, suddenly exhausted. Margaret sat down across from me. "I know that was horrible, but listen to me. They're desperate. This kind of aggressive move often means they know they're on weak ground. They're trying to intimidate you into settling." "It's working," I admitted. "Margaret, I'm 72 years old. I'm tired. Maybe I should just—" "No." Her voice was firm. "Don't you dare give up now. Eleanor chose you. She wanted you to have this home. Are you really going to let those vultures win?" I thought about Eleanor's letter, her journals, the 35 years of friendship we'd shared. "No," I said finally. "No, I'm not." "Good. Now I want you to take a few days for yourself. Don't think about this case. Don't answer their calls if they contact you. Visit your children, see a movie, do something that brings you joy. You need to recharge before the real battle begins." She was right. I called my daughter in California that night, and she insisted I come visit for a week. "Get away from all of it, Mom. Clear your head." I booked a flight for the following morning. California was exactly what I needed. My daughter Sarah and her husband Tom lived in a beautiful home in San Diego, close to the ocean. My grandchildren, now teenagers, were delighted to have me visit. For a week, I walked on the beach, played board games, and didn't think about lawyers or court battles or greedy relatives. But the world had a way of intruding. On my 4th day there, I received a phone call from an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Mrs. Harrison?" A smooth, professional voice, not Richard or Patricia. "My name is Jonathan Marks. I'm a mediator specializing in estate disputes. I've been asked by the Whitmore family to reach out to you regarding a possible settlement." A mediator. They were changing tactics. "I already told Patricia I'm not selling," I said. "Please, hear me out. The Whitmores have authorized me to offer you $350,000 for the property. That's significantly more than their previous offer and much closer to market value." $350,000. I could give some to each of my children, ensure my grandchildren's college education, live comfortably for the rest of my life. But it still wasn't what Eleanor had wanted for me. "The offer also includes covering all your legal fees to date," Jonathan continued. "Plus, you'd avoid the stress and uncertainty of a trial. These cases can take years, Mrs. Harrison. Years of depositions, court appearances, emotional turmoil, and there's always the chance you could lose." There it was, the fear tactic wrapped in reasonable concern. "Mr. Marks," I said calmly, "I appreciate you taking the time to call. But my answer is the same. This house was a gift from my friend. It's not for sale. Mrs. Harrison, I urge you to reconsider." I hung up. Sarah had been listening from the kitchen doorway. "Mom, you okay?" I told her everything about Eleanor's will, Richard and Patricia's contest, the offers, the threats. She listened without interrupting, her face growing progressively angrier. "They're awful," she said when I finished. "Mom, you can't give in to people like that. Eleanor wanted you to have that house. You've earned it. But what if they're right? What if I do lose in court? Then you lose. But at least you'll have fought for what's yours. Eleanor chose you over her own blood relatives. That means something. Sarah took my hand. You taught me to stand up for myself, to not let anyone push me around. Don't stop now. Her words reminded me of who I'd been before all this, a woman who'd survived, who'd fought, who'd never backed down when she knew she was right. When I returned home a week later, I felt centered, calm, ready. Margaret Chen had news waiting for me. The mediator contacted me as well. When I told him you'd refuse their offer, they increased it to 400,000. I'm not interested. I know, I told them as much. She smiled. They're scared, Margaret. They wouldn't keep increasing the offer if they were confident about winning. Over the next 2 weeks, the Whitmores tried a different approach. Social pressure. They started a whisper campaign in town. I'd hear it at the grocery store, at church, in the pharmacy. Did you hear about Margaret Harrison? Took advantage of poor Eleanor. So sad what people will do for money. Some of my neighbors started looking at me differently. Mrs. Patterson, who'd been friendly for years, suddenly became cold and distant. The mailman stopped making small talk. It hurt. I'd lived in this town for 35 years, and now people were questioning my character based on lies and insinuations. But then something unexpected happened. I was at the farmer's market on Saturday morning when Helen Rodriguez approached me. She'd been Eleanor's friend from church, one of the few people who'd actually visited her regularly. Margaret, she said loudly, so everyone nearby could hear, I want you to know that I think what Eleanor did was beautiful. You were a true friend to her, and anyone spreading rumors otherwise is a liar and a fool. Several people stopped and stared. Helen continued, her voice strong and clear. Eleanor talked about you all the time, about how you were more family to her than her actual relatives. She was so happy when she told me she was leaving you the house. She said it was the rightest thing she'd ever done. Tears sprang to my eyes. She told you? 6 months before she died. Made me promise not to say anything until after. Helen took my hand. You fight for that house, you hear me? Eleanor wanted you to have it, and I'll testify to that in court if I need to. Other people began to speak up. Mr. Chen from the hardware store. I remember how you used to come in and buy supplies to fix things at Eleanor's house. Never charged her, just did it out of kindness. Mrs. Yamamoto from the library. Eleanor told me once that you were the daughter she never had. Those were her exact words. One by one, people who'd actually known Eleanor, who'd witnessed our friendship, came forward. The whisper campaign evaporated in the face of truth. That evening, I received a text from an unknown number. You're making this harder than it needs to be. We won't forget this. I showed it to Margaret Chen. Document everything, she advised. Every threat, every contact. It all helps our case. The Whitmores had tried money, they'd tried social pressure, and both had failed. I wondered what they'd try next. 2 weeks before the court hearing was scheduled, Richard and Patricia showed up at my door unannounced. It was a Sunday morning, and I was getting ready for church. We need to talk, Richard said when I opened the door. He looked different, less angry, more defeated. Please, just 5 minutes, against my better judgment. I let them in. Maybe Margaret Chen's prediction was right. Maybe they were finally ready to give up. They sat on my sofa, and for a moment, no one spoke. Patricia looked around the room with barely concealed longing, her eyes lingering on the built-in bookshelves, the fireplace, the bay window overlooking the garden. This is hard for me to say, Richard began, and his voice actually sounded sincere. But we've been thinking a lot about Aunt Eleanor, about our relationship with her, or lack thereof. I waited, saying nothing. You're right, Patricia added softly. We weren't there for her. We got caught up in our own lives, our careers, and we let the years slip away. That's on us. Was this real? Were they actually admitting their failure? We can't change the past, Richard continued, but we're trying to make peace with it. And part of that means making peace with you. He leaned forward, his eyes meeting mine. We know Aunt Eleanor loved you. We can see that now, reading through the evidence, seeing how people in town talk about you. You were good to her. She was good to me, too, I said quietly. We're not contesting that anymore, Patricia said. What we're asking for is a compromise, a way for both of us to honor Eleanor's memory. Here it comes, I thought. The house means something to our family, Richard said. My grandfather built it. My mother grew up in it. When I was a child, I spent summers here. His voice caught with what sounded like genuine emotion, letting it go completely. It feels like we're losing the last connection to our family history. But we understand why Eleanor left it to you, Patricia jumped in. So here's what we propose. Let us buy the house at full market value, $500,000. That's fair. That's generous. And in return, we'd like to keep just a few items of sentimental value. Some photographs. Maybe a few pieces of furniture that belong to our grandfather. Things that have no real value to you, but mean the world to us. $500,000. Full market value. Plus they were admitting I'd earned it, that I deserved something. It was the most reasonable they'd ever sounded. Think about it, Richard said. You could buy a wonderful house somewhere else. Somewhere easier to maintain, maybe closer to your daughter in California. You'd have financial security, and we'd have the family home back. Everyone wins. We'd even be willing to let you stay here while you look for a new place, Patricia added. Rent-free for up to 6 months. No rush, no pressure. It sounded perfect, almost too perfect. Can I think about it? I asked. Of course, Richard said, standing up. But we need to know soon. The court date is approaching, and we'd need to file to dismiss the case if we're going to settle. They left, and I sat in my living room, my head spinning. $500,000. Financial security. Peace. An end to the stress and fear. I called Margaret Chen immediately and told her about the offer. Don't answer yet, she said firmly. Let me do some digging. Something feels off about this. The next day, she called me back. I found it. I knew something was wrong. What? Richard and Patricia took out a second mortgage on their Boston property 3 months ago. They're in financial trouble. Serious trouble. They owe over $600,000 in debt. My blood ran cold. So the money they're offering me, they don't have it. They'd be borrowing against this house once they got title to it. But here's the kicker. I had a contact at the county recorder's office check something for me. If you sell them the house, even at market value, and they mortgage it immediately afterward, guess who'd be on the hook if they default? I don't understand. There's a clause in estate transfers that can make the original beneficiary liable for debts accrued within the first year if the property was obtained through questionable means. If they can prove you shouldn't have inherited it in the first place, which is exactly what they've been arguing, then their debts become your problem. But that's insane! The court hasn't ruled. Exactly. They need you to sell to them before the court rules in your favor. Once the judge validates Eleanor's will, that clause doesn't apply. But if you sell now, while it's still contested... She paused. Margaret, this isn't a peace offering. It's a trap. I felt sick. The emotion in Richard's voice, Patricia's soft apologies, all of it had been an act, a manipulation. That afternoon, Richard called. Have you made a decision? Yes, I said, my voice cold. The house isn't for sale. Not now, not ever. The change in his voice was instant. The kindness evaporated, replaced by pure venom. You stupid old woman. Do you have any idea what you're doing? We were offering you a way out that would leave me liable for your debts. I know about the mortgage, Richard. I know about your financial problems. There was silence on the other end. Then, who told you that? That's private financial information. It's public record, I said. You really thought I wouldn't check? You're going to regret this, he hissed. When we win in court, you'll get nothing. Nothing. We'll make sure you're evicted so fast your head will spin. And those items I mentioned? The photographs, the furniture? We're claiming all of it. Every single thing in that house that belonged to Eleanor. And we'll prove it all belonged to her, not you. Try it, I said and hung up. My hands were shaking. My heart was pounding. Part of me was terrified. They'd threatened to take everything, to leave me with nothing. But another part of me, a stronger part, felt something different. Determination? They'd tried to manipulate me one last time and I'd seen through it. I'd stood my ground. Eleanor had been right to leave me this house. I was strong enough to fight for it. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected. Wooden benches, fluorescent lighting, an American flag in the corner. Judge Maria Santos presided, a stern-looking woman in her 60s with sharp, intelligent eyes. Richard and Patricia sat with their lawyer, Douglas Preston, at one table. I sat with Margaret Chen at another. My hands were folded calmly in my lap, but inside, my heart raced. This was it. Everything came down to this. Preston went first, painting a picture of a vulnerable elderly woman manipulated by a cunning tenant. Eleanor Whitmore was isolated from her family by Mrs. Harrison, he argued. Every attempt by my clients to visit or call was undermined. Mrs. Harrison positioned herself as the sole caregiver, the only friend, systematically cutting Eleanor off from her blood relatives. It was a compelling narrative, if you didn't know the truth. When it was Margaret's turn, she stood with quiet confidence. Your Honor, I'd like to submit Eleanor Whitmore's personal journals into evidence. 15 years of daily entries that document her relationship with both her family and Mrs. Harrison. Preston jumped to his feet. Objection! Those journals are private. They were left to Mrs. Harrison along with the rest of the estate, Margaret countered. And they directly refute the claims of isolation and manipulation. Judge Santos examined the journals herself, reading selected passages we'd marked. Her expression grew grimmer with each page. Then Margaret called her first witness, Helen Rodriguez. Helen took the stand with dignity, her voice strong and clear. Eleanor talked about Margaret all the time, how Margaret helped her with groceries, drove her to doctor's appointments, kept her company. She said Margaret was more family than her actual family. And did Mrs. Whitmore ever express being isolated from her nephew, Richard? Margaret asked. Isolated? Helen almost laughed. Eleanor called them constantly. She'd leave messages, send cards, try to arrange visits. They never came, never called back. She cried about it sometimes, wondering what she'd done wrong to make them not care. Preston tried to shake her testimony on cross-examination, but Helen was unflappable. Next came Mr. Morrison, Eleanor's attorney, testifying about her mental state. Mrs. Whitmore was absolutely clear about her wishes. She told me, and I quote, Richard and Patricia see me as an obligation. Margaret sees me as a friend. I choose friendship. Then came the medical experts who'd evaluated Eleanor, confirming she'd been of completely sound mind. But the bombshell came when Margaret called me to the stand. She walked me through my relationship with Eleanor, 35 years of friendship documented in photographs and receipts and memories. Then she handed me Eleanor's letter. Would you read this to the court, please? My voice shook as I read Eleanor's words aloud, her love and gratitude filling the courtroom. When I finished, I saw several people in the gallery wiping their eyes. Preston approached for cross-examination, his expression hard. Mrs. Harrison, isn't it true that you never paid fair market rent for the property? I paid what Eleanor charged. She never raised the rent in 35 years. Exactly, because you manipulated her into keeping it low. Objection! Margaret stood. Speculation. Sustained, Judge Santos said. Preston tried again. Isn't it true that you isolated Mrs. Whitmore from her family? No, I said firmly. Eleanor's family isolated themselves. I have her journals documenting years of unreturned phone calls and forgotten birthdays. Those journals could have been altered. Mr. Preston, Judge Santos interrupted, her voice icy. I've examined those journals. The entries span 15 years in consistent handwriting, with dated receipts and photographs corroborating the accounts. Unless you're suggesting Mrs. Harrison is a master forger, your insinuation is baseless. Preston's face reddened. He tried a few more questions, but I answered each one calmly, truthfully. Then Margaret dropped the final bomb. Your Honor, I'd like to introduce evidence of the plaintiff's financial situation. They recently borrowed $600,000 against their Boston property, and they attempted to pressure Mrs. Harrison into selling them this house under terms that would have made her liable for their debts. That's a lie, Richard shouted, jumping to his feet. Mr. Whitmore, sit down, Judge Santos commanded. Margaret presented the mortgage documents, the recorded phone call where Richard had threatened me. I'd started recording our conversations after the harassment began, on Margaret's advice, and testimony from the mediator about the escalating settlement offers. They weren't trying to preserve family history, Margaret concluded. They were trying to solve their financial problems at Mrs. Harrison's expense. Preston scrambled to respond, but the damage was done. Richard and Patricia's entire case had been built on the premise of grieving relatives fighting for their rightful inheritance. Now they were revealed as what they truly were: greedy, desperate people willing to destroy a 72-year-old woman's life to solve their money problems. Judge Santos called a 15-minute recess. When she returned, her decision was swift. I've reviewed all the evidence presented today. Eleanor Whitmore's journals paint a clear picture of a woman who was neglected by her blood relatives and cherished by her tenant. The medical evaluations confirm she was of sound mind. Her attorney confirms her explicit intentions. She looked directly at Richard and Patricia. This court finds no evidence of undue influence or manipulation. Eleanor Whitmore's will stands as written. The gavel came down. I'd won. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Richard's face turned purple with rage. Patricia buried her face in her hands. Douglas Preston gathered his papers with tight, angry movements. Judge Santos wasn't finished. Furthermore, I'm awarding Mrs. Harrison her legal fees, to be paid by the plaintiffs. The evidence shows this contest was filed in bad faith, with full knowledge that Eleanor Whitmore was competent and had valid reasons for her decisions. Margaret squeezed my hand under the table. We'd won, not just the house, but complete vindication. Preston stood, his voice strained. Your Honor, my clients request time to arrange payment. They should have thought of that before filing a frivolous lawsuit, Judge Santos cut him off. You have 30 days to pay Mrs. Harrison's legal fees in full. If payment isn't received, I'll authorize garnishment of wages and assets. She looked at Richard and Patricia with barely concealed disgust. You neglected your aunt for decades, then tried to profit from her death. The court finds your behavior reprehensible. As people filed out of the courtroom, Richard pushed past me roughly. This isn't over, he hissed. Actually, it is, Margaret Chen said calmly, stepping between us. And if you contact my client again, we'll file for a restraining order and pursue harassment charges. Patricia stopped in front of me, her eyes blazing with hatred. You stole our inheritance. You're nothing but a manipulative... Mrs. Whitmore, Judge Santos's voice rang out from the bench. She hadn't left yet. One more word and I'll hold you in contempt of court. Leave. Now. They left, Preston hurrying them out before they could make things worse for themselves. Outside the courthouse, Helen Rodriguez was waiting with a group of people from town. Friends of Eleanor's, neighbors, people who'd watched our friendship over the years. They broke into applause when I emerged. We knew you'd win, Helen said, hugging me tight. Eleanor's smiling down on you right now. The local newspaper ran the story the next day. Judge upholds elderly woman's will. CT's journals documenting family neglect. The article detailed the court proceedings, Eleanor's journals, and the revelation of Richard and Patricia's financial schemes. The whisper campaign that had tried to paint me as a manipulator evaporated overnight. Now the whispers were about Richard and Patricia, how they'd abandoned their aunt, tried to steal from an old woman, lied to the court. A week later, Margaret Chen called with an update. They paid. Full legal fees, just under deadline. They liquidated some assets to do it. Good, I said simply. There's more. Preston and Associates dropped them as clients. Apparently having a judge call your lawsuit frivolous and in bad faith is bad for a law firm's reputation. And I heard through the grapevine that Richard's employer wasn't happy about the negative publicity. He's been asked to resign. I should have felt sympathy. I should have felt guilty that their lives were falling apart. But I didn't. They'd tried to destroy me, to take away Eleanor's final gift, to paint me as a villain when all I'd done was be a friend. They deserved every consequence they faced. The real victory came a month later when I received a letter from Richard and Patricia's new attorney. They were formally dropping all claims to the property and any items within it. They were also offering a written apology, required by their lawyer, I suspected, to prevent me from pursuing my own lawsuit for harassment. The apology was stiff, impersonal, clearly written by their attorney. But at the end, there was a handwritten note from Patricia. We underestimated you. That was our mistake. Yes, it was. I framed Eleanor's letter and hung it in the living room, next to the photograph of us in the garden. Every morning, I'd sit in my chair, in my house, and read her words. The house felt different now, lighter, like Eleanor's spirit had finally been laid to rest, satisfied that her wishes had been honored. I planted new roses in the garden that spring, varieties I'd always wanted to try. Eleanor had taught me everything about gardening, and now I could continue her legacy in this space that was finally, legally, irrevocably mine. The property deed arrived in the mail, my name printed officially, Margaret Elizabeth Harrison, sole owner. I traced my fingers over the words and thought about Eleanor, about 35 years of friendship, about standing up for what was right, about not letting bullies win. Thank you, I whispered to her memory, for everything. The house seemed to whisper back, you earned it. 6 months after the court victory, my life had transformed in ways I never imagined. The first thing I did was exactly what Eleanor would have wanted. I made the house truly mine. I repainted the master bedroom in soft lavender. I replaced the old kitchen countertops with beautiful granite. I planted a vegetable garden alongside the roses. Every improvement felt like a conversation with Eleanor. My daughter Sarah and her family came to visit that summer, staying for 2 full weeks. Watching my grandchildren run through the house, hearing their laughter echo through rooms that had been quiet for so long, it filled me with indescribable joy. Mom, you seem different, Sarah said one evening as we sat on the porch. Happier, stronger. I fought for something and won, I said simply. It changes you. The community embraced me in new ways. Helen Rodriguez and I became close friends, meeting for lunch every week. I joined the church committee and started volunteering at the library. People saw me differently now, not as a victim, but as a woman who'd stood her ground and won. But the real sweetness came from watching Richard and Patricia's world crumble. Through the town grapevine, I learned how their lives unraveled. Richard lost his job at the Boston investment firm. The negative publicity from the trial made him unemployable in his field. He took a position at a much smaller firm for half his previous salary. Patricia's social standing evaporated. The story had made it into the Boston papers, and their friends distanced themselves from the couple who'd tried to cheat an elderly woman out of her inheritance. They had to sell their Boston property to pay off their debts. The beautiful brownstone they'd been so proud of, gone. They moved to a small apartment in the suburbs. Their marriage struggled too. Financial stress, public humiliation, the loss of everything they'd built. It created cracks that grew into chasms. I heard rumors of separation. The final blow came when they tried to sell Eleanor's jewelry, the items they had inherited. They discovered that Eleanor had donated most of the truly valuable pieces to charities years ago. What they received was worth perhaps $10,000 total. One afternoon, I ran into Douglas Preston at the courthouse. "Mrs. Harrison," he said, nodding politely. There was an awkward pause. Then he said, "For what it's worth, you deserve to win." I knew it even while representing them. I thanked him and walked away, feeling closure. Meanwhile, my own life bloomed. I started taking art classes at the community center, painting landscapes of the garden, portraits of Eleanor from memory. I set up a small trust fund for each of my grandchildren's education. Eleanor's gift was creating opportunities for the next generation. I adopted a rescue dog, a sweet old golden retriever named Maggie. She and I walked the neighborhood every morning, two old girls enjoying our second chances at happiness. On what would have been Eleanor's 92nd birthday, I held a small gathering at the house. Helen came, along with other friends Eleanor had made through church. We shared stories, laughed, cried, and toasted her memory. "She made the right choice," Helen said, raising her glass. "This house is alive again because of you, Margaret. This is exactly what Eleanor wanted." As I looked around at the people filling my home, at the garden blooming outside, at the life I'd built from Eleanor's generous gift, I knew Helen was right. I had won. Not just the legal battle, but something far more important. I'd won the chance to honor a friend's legacy, to prove that kindness and loyalty matter, and to live the rest of my life surrounded by love and beauty. Richard and Patricia had lost everything trying to take what wasn't theirs. Justice, as it turned out, was real. Here I am, 5 years later, still in this house that Eleanor gave me. Still living proof that loyalty and friendship are worth more than blood and greed. Standing up for what's right isn't easy, but it's always worth it. Eleanor chose love over obligation and gave me more than a house. She gave me validation and hope. What would you have done? Would you have fought or taken the money and walked away? Leave a comment below. Share your story. Subscribe to hear more stories about courage and justice. Thank you for listening. May you always have the strength to stand up for what you believe in.